Good morning in Europe and good afternoon in Singapore. Welcome to the Center for Asian Affairs at the University of Łódź new series, Asian Debates. This project is supported by Ministry of Education and Science, and it's also in partnership with Pulaski Foundation and Radio Łódź as a media partner. Briefly about the think tank, Center for Asian Affairs at the University of Łódź. The think tanks consist of specialists proficient in Asian languages, and I think it's a big advantage here, plus extensive practical experience across the region. We publish monthly monitors, China, Japan, Korean Peninsula, ASEAN, and China in the Balkans, plus up-to-date commentaries on the current dynamics and situation in East Asia and Europe in both languages, Polish and English. So I'd like to invite you to visit our webpage. Now, briefly, let me introduce Grzegorz, because he will not be in a position to do so in a minute. Grzegorz is an analyst at Merix. His research focuses on EU-China relations, including institutional framework, strategic discourse, and EU common foreign policy building efforts. Before joining Merix, he founded a Brussels-based nonprofit platform, EU-China Hub, and co-founded of Beijing-based agency company focused on the impact of the BRI across the world. He worked as a contributor to Oxford Analytica. He holds a Master of Science degree from Oxford University in Contemporary China Studies as a recipient of Jenkins Memorial Scholarship, a Master of Economics from Yenjing University, from Yenjing Academy, in Beijing, and master degree and BA degree in international relations. And also he worked with us a couple of years ago. And now, Grzegorz, please take up your duties as a chair, and I'm expecting a very fruitful discussion ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominic, and that's definitely a lovely duty. Thank you for the kind introduction and also for the invitation to moderate debate with such a distinguished panel. The topic of our discussion today is the role of Europe and Southeast Asia in the Pacific. And looking at it from the EU capitals, it couldn't be more timely. Over those last few months, the EU announced its dedicated Indo-Pacific strategy, was caught by surprise by the AUKUS announcement, and saw increasing tensions with Beijing over Lithuania's engagement with Taiwan, also an Indo-Pacific actor. At the same time, Brussels continues to refer to its partnership with ASEAN as the cornerstone of the EU's engagement with the Indo-Pacific, also on the basis of the strategic partnership that was concluded in December 2020. But how important is the EU for the ASEAN itself? Well, first of all, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the region is in the spotlight of global attention right now. And here, quoting from a dedicated European Commission's assessment of the Indo-Pacific, it is a home to 3/5 of the world's population, produces 60% of global GDP, contributed 2/3 of pre-pandemic global economic growth, and is at the forefront of the digital economy. But even beyond these economic factors, the region also sees increasing geopolitical tensions, it sees intensifying competition, and it sees significant military buildup. So what strategies do the EU and the ASEAN hold towards the region? And how does China and Taiwan fit into the picture? What can we expect in the coming months? And to discuss those very questions, we have with us a panel of exceptional experts. And we could spend the entire event basically just listing the affiliations and achievements of our guests. So let's just keep it simple, short, and crisp. Let me get through the key points of our panelists' rich biographies. So let me welcome Mr. Bill Hayton, who is an associate fellow with the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House and formerly a journalist with BBC News between 1998 and 2021. In this capacity, he worked in Vietnam between 2006-2007 and in Myanmar between 2013-2014. In his research, he focuses on the South China Sea disputes and current affairs in Southeast Asia. He has briefed government departments, officials, and companies in the UK, the US, Europe, and Asia, and has written numerous media outlets to numerous media outlets on these very subjects. Mr. Hayton, Bill, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. It's great to join you all.
Our next speaker is Dr. William Chong, who is a senior fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He was previously Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies until January 2020. In that capacity, he helped to run the annual ISS Shangri-La Dialogue, named as Asia's premier security summit. His research focuses on regional security issues in the Asia-Pacific. Dr. Chong, William, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Pleasure.
Finally, last but certainly not least, Dr. David Camreux, who is a senior researcher within the Centre de Recherche Internationale. He's also an associate professor at Sciences Po, where he teaches on contemporary Southeast Asian society, EU-Asian relations, and Asian regional integration. He has been a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, the Central European University, Gajah Mada University, and Korea University. Outside of his academic activities, he's also a member of the Asia-Pacific Commission, advising the International Secretariat of the governing party in France. He has contributed to a number of pan-European projects linked to Southeast Asia, such as EU-NESCA, Garnet, and Mercury. Dr. Camreux, David, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
My pleasure.
So to open our discussion, let me start with a very broad question that I would want to ask to all of you. Why exactly is it that the Indo-Pacific region, however it gets defined, why is it that it comes to top of the agenda of so many actors recently? Why there and why now? Who would want to go first?
Well, I'll say a brief thing. I think it's the combination of the perception of opportunities and threats, as you outlined in your introduction, the sense that it's going to be the dynamic hub of the global economy in the coming decades, but also contains the potential to destabilize the world with conflicts and disputes. And I think the EU would like to believe that the spread of its version of sort of order with lots of rules and processes is something that could contribute to managing the stresses in this region. I don't know what the others think.
Yeah, I would like to add to what Bill said. I mean, like he put it very succinctly, it's a balance of challenge and opportunity. It's like what you mentioned, Greg, earlier about this ASEAN and Indo-Pacific's growing economic and geopolitical weight, as well as the fact that you need to stabilize essentially what are one of the regions, if not the world's most kind of potent hotspots that we see today. The Senkaku Diaoyu Islands dispute, the Taiwan Straits crisis, which we see in the news every day, the South China Sea disputes, of course, and of course what's happening in the DPRK and the ramifications that it would have on China and Japan and the United States and other states in the Indo-Pacific. I also see that, of course, there's a question of China. I mean, there's not a single day in our industry where China is not talked about at length, and I think there's a kind of reluctance actually to deal with the challenge posed by China, and I do not just talk about what Western powers talk about when they talk about China challenging kind of the status quo in the region, but also assessing, more soft power aspects of how China is making inroads into individual societies in Southeast Asia as well as the rest of the Indo-Pacific. And I'm referring specifically to kind of Chinese influence operations that you see right now, in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Indonesia, going as far as New Zealand and Australia. And I'll just stop there. Thank you.
I think there are two preliminary questions. First one is, which Europe are we talking about? And the second question is, which Indo-Pacific are we talking about? three countries developed Indo-Pacific strategies, starting with France in 2018. France is the only European middle power resident in the Indo-Pacific. At least that's how it portrays itself. They were followed then by Germany and the Netherlands, and this led ultimately to the Indo-Pacific strategy, which was announced on the 16th of September, the day after the announcement of AUKUS. And perhaps I'll come back to talking about AUKUS later. I've just published a small blog on that subject. That strategy was supported by those three countries who already had a strategy. 7 other countries signed up, but most of Europe, the members of the European Union, don't particularly are not all that interested in the Pacific. I think we should be clear of that. That is the concern of Germany, of France, potentially of Italy, of Spain, the larger countries, and now of Lithuania amongst the Baltic states because of Chinese assertiveness. I must admit that Xi Jinping should be given the Charlemagne Prize for European integration alongside Mr. Putin, because his actions, as in the Indo-Pacific itself, are creating a coalition in a sense, or at least a unity of views against China. And I think the Chinese are themselves responsible for that. Britain then followed up with, actually the same time had its Indo-Pacific strategy. And that has to be seen in a particular domestic context. It gives substance to the idea of global Britain, of Britain's role in a post-Brexit world. It is not, in fact, purely accidental that AUKUS was announced the day before the EU presented its Indo-Pacific strategy. And nobody talked about the European Union's Indo-Pacific strategy because everybody was talking about AUKUS. So, Boris Johnson once again performed a wonderful political coup in this case. So, I think I partly disagree with William. I think that we've seen the end of European naivety about China. I think there's a convergence of views across the Atlantic of seeing China, in the trilogy of being partner, someone you cooperate with, and being a systemic rival, partner, competitor, and systemic rival. So again, thank you to Mr. Xi Jinping. We now have a transatlantic, if you like, consensus on dealing with China. But effectively, how we do that is that's the hard question.
Thank you very much. And David, if I can pick up on some of the themes that you mentioned, what is then the EU's motivation behind the Indo-Pacific strategy? Because you mentioned that it comes actually from 3 specific member states that started the debate, that there is no clear alignment across the EU on the importance of Indo-Pacific. So what is actually the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy trying to achieve? Is it just about responding to China, diversifying in Asia? What's the key goal here?
Okay, I mean, if I can do a bit of advertising, we have an observatory of the Indo-Pacific, a Franco-German observatory with GIGA in Hamburg, and we'll be inaugurating our website in January. And we're doing a lot of mapping, and the mapping shows that different countries have their Indo-Pacific varies. So the European Indo-Pacific strategy is a kind of consensus of the French and German view. The French view, of course, is to comfort France's role as a resident power in the Indo-Pacific. So you can't think about France in the Indo-Pacific without thinking about New Caledonia, a referendum last weekend about Reunion Island, and France's and the fact that France is the second maritime not power, but has the second largest exclusive economic zone because of this confetti, so to speak, of empire. I think what is positive about the European strategy is that the Europeans have understood they've got to play to their strength. It's not by sending a German frigate, or even Her Majesty HMS Queen Elizabeth, that the Europeans are going to weigh heavily on security questions. So, you know, where can Europe contribute? Well, Europe has two advantages. It is not China and it is not the United States. And those two advantages are to be played to. So, in fact, there's the Indo-Pacific strategy, but two other important announcements have occurred in the last couple of months. The second is the Global Gateway Initiative, which has a strong orientation towards the Indo-Pacific and particularly to Southeast Asia and towards ASEAN. And the second, which hasn't got much publicity at all, is this, it just announced on the 9th of December, actually. It's the Global Europe Human Rights and Democracy Program. Now, the budgets are quite different. For the Global Gateway, we're talking about 300 billion euros, a lot of that to be raised from private sources. For the Human Rights and Democracy Program, we're talking about 1.5 billion. But I think we have to see these three, the Indo-Pacific strategy with these two other projects as a kind of forming a kind of whole. So the European objective is to play to its strength and essentially to be an investment partner, to offer a third way, so to speak, to countries of Southeast Asia in terms of getting investment and in terms of also of political relations.
Thank you very much. Yes, Bill?
Although not a member of the European Union anymore, I'll chip in. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, when the EU announced its strategic outlook on China almost 2 years ago, March 2019, that was the first time we saw the four-part framework, you know, the cooperation partner, a negotiating partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. And I think that was a very smart way, and still is a very smart way of characterizing the EU relationship. It's just that the emphasis, you know, I think we're now more into the rival and cooperate where we can bit rather than the sort of more balanced approach. And it's interesting when Josep Borrell, the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy, was installed. I mean, he seemed to kind of have a much more optimistic view about, kind of cooperation with China. But I think he's become more skeptical. I mean, last year, you know, he sort of blogged, you know, a bit like what David just said, you know, but he was saying the European Union shares many common views with ASEAN, in particular the will not to align with China or the US. And so I think this idea to sort of be an alternative is quite strong. I think when you read the Indo-Pacific strategy as published, everything about that strategy to me seems to be about hedging the risk from China. It's about diversifying your supply chains to other places. And really, you know, if you look for the word China, it's in terms of things like, you know, we must combat plastic pollution and we have to be careful about the South China Sea disputes. It's definitely not the language of, you know, we're all together, we're going to save the world kind of thing. And one other thing I think about the Indo-Pacific for Europeans is it's extraordinarily large. Because it starts in Somalia, you can say that the EU's anti-piracy operations around Somalia are a contribution to the Indo-Pacific. And then France can obviously talk about its Pacific territories as well, and it can all come under the same umbrella. If the UK were part of it, it would be doing probably the same kind of things, I think, in lots of ways. I mean, it will find ways to work with it. I mean, the EU, so the UK has not announced a strategy, but we have this strange Indo-Pacific tilt in our foreign policy. We're going to lean gently in that direction. And as David says, it's very much, you know, it's a response to Brexit in lots of ways to demonstrate that we have opportunities. And I think just the way the British government works, you know, that sort of the relations with the EU are being dealt with by one part of government, and the Foreign Office, you know, needs to do something. So it's really going big on the Indo-Pacific at the moment.
Thank you. And referring to the point that Bill mentioned, that would be my question to William. Bill mentioned that from the EU side, there is this perception that neither the EU nor the ASEAN want to make a specific choice amid the Sino-American competition. Is this also the approach that you see from the ASEAN side, William? And how is the reception also in Singapore and wider in ASEAN countries of the EU's efforts with its Indo-Pacific strategy?
Oh, if you want to talk about Southeast Asian response to the EU strategy, well, you have to dig deep because there's a growing pile of Indo-Pacific strategies, like David said, has been announced. And I'm afraid that whereas it's a black and white document, I read all 17 pages of it, and the kind of the DNA, the kind of the thrust of the document is actually very similar to ASEAN and would be amicable to ASEAN in the form of cooperation, connectivity, rules-based order. But I'm afraid that, as David mentioned earlier, it was completely overtaken by the AUKUS deal that was announced a day earlier, and so I think that's the problem here for ASEAN as a regional body. On one hand, we would be very receptive to what David has saying about the two pillars. When the EU plays to its strengths on infrastructure, on the global gateway, and of course that global human rights and democracy program that you mentioned about. Unfortunately, those are kind of second order priorities that tend to get swept away whenever geopolitical tensions or problems in Myanmar creep up. So there's a lot of focus on AUKUS, not simply because of the nuts and bolts of the deal. Essentially, it's a nuclear power technology sharing agreement and enhanced interoperability between the UK, US, and Australia. But I think what is more worrying for ASEAN is the fact that what was supposed to be, to use that acronym, zone of peace, and neutrality is becoming a region that is increasingly contested, in the sense that the EU Indo-Pacific strategy is just another strategy that external powers have, So starting from Japan, the United States, Australia, now going to France and Germany and even the UK with this Indo-Pacific too. There is a kind of wariness and fatigue within ASEAN to say that, hey, wait a minute, we are happy that we're getting a lot of spotlight and attention from outside the region, but then it's kind of like there's a sense that, hey, we're getting external powers to tell us what our neighborhood should be, but who should be the arbiters and who should be the parties who should decide what the neighborhood should be? It should be ASEAN itself, and that's why I think that's why ASEAN as a rearguard action came out with the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which if you read the document itself, it's very ASEAN in the sense that it's a low common denominator, right? It talks about, very ASEAN-esque kind of stuff like connectivity and maritime cooperation, development. But there's actually nothing seriously new about the document. But again, it's just a ASEAN seeking to kind of press its kind of imprimatur on the region, given that we have so many external powers. They are trying to dictate, what the Indo-Pacific is about. And I don't think the debate in ASEAN has ended as yet.
I'll just chip in there maybe. From the title, you can learn something. It's not ASEAN's Indo-Pacific outlook. It's ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific, i.e. the Indo-Pacific is somebody else's idea and we've taken a view on it. It's not our idea. But I think, the AUKUS thing, it is remarkable how much attention it got globally, really. Ultimately, as William says, it's a big arms deal. it's about are you going to, whose submarines are you going to buy? But it became emblematic, I guess. People saw it as a sign of a changing world, and obviously there was a European dimension to that as well, and there was an Asian dimension to it. I don't think, by the way, that the announcement was deliberately timed to blow up the EU's announcement. My understanding is that the EU was going to announce its Indo-Pacific strategy the day before, but that was delayed because Ursula von der Leyen wanted to make her State of the Union speech, and she didn't want it overshadowed by the Indo-Pacific thing. So my feeling is that it wasn't quite as much of a snub as that, but it clearly had a big impact in France. I'm afraid the sort of UK response was upsetting the French isn't such a bad thing. That this kind of shows that Britain can be agile and it can do things. I think it was a very short-term thing, the way that it was announced, with long-term damage. But I would say that the foundation for the deal had been laid long before. I mean, the Five Eyes relationship has been going for decades. There was a treaty between the UK and Australia to build warships and defence cooperation about 5 years ago, which nobody noticed, and this kind of builds on that. But it was a moment, I think, when suddenly people thought the world had changed. I think that's why it got so much attention.
And one thing that's referring exactly to the points about the UK, also about ASEAN, bringing it all together, that would be a wider question. Are the strategies and frameworks that are being pushed forward by regional groupings such as ASEAN or as the EU, can they be as effective as the ones that are pursued by specific nation states, as we saw the UK moving quite quickly when it comes to developing its tilt towards Indo-Pacific. Also, as we see the AUKUS deal also being orchestrated between the specific nation states. What do you think is the medium, and what would be the role of this kind of regional groupings, and can they be as effective in terms of bringing tangible results as nation states?
Could I just say something, first of all, about the end of European naivety about China? I think we've got to go back to the beginning, the end of last year, when the Chinese were pushing for this comprehensive investment agreement to be signed with the EU. Now, my understanding, I have one of my former colleagues is the advisor to Joseph Borrell, Professor Zaki Laidi, and he said it was the Chinese who were pushing for this. And basically what the Chinese offered was the same conditions as they'd offered to President Trump, under the first phase of the trade agreement. Now, the fact that agreement was not ratified by the European Parliament, and then we've had tit-for-tat sanctions, and it's unlikely to be ratified, because even if the European Parliament ratifies it, it has to be ratified by the other 27 or 28 or God knows how many parliaments. So I think that was a kind of I think the naivety had already been ended, but the fact that you couldn't go forward on this investment agreement has pushed the Europeans in general to have a more sort of realpolitik view of China. And that we're perhaps more in terms of competition rather than partnership at the moment. It's significant that at the Glasgow summit, the agreement was between the Americans and the Chinese. The Europeans assented to it, but they were not, were not a third party in that agreement in Glasgow. But perhaps I'll let the others come back to your question on regional agreements. ASEAN is very important for the European Union, for better or for worse. For better because it's the oldest inter-regional relationship in the world that the EU has. EU foreign policy is based on the idea, wow, if everybody else did what we did in Europe, love and peace, brotherhood, the world would be a better place. So, the European Union does, finance regional integration. I mean, 2/3 up to I've seen a figure of 96% of the budget of the ASEAN Secretariat comes from external powers, even the United States, Australia, Germany, and the European Union. So if ASEAN didn't exist, the Europeans would try and invent it. Okay, now the downside of that is that there's the idea that the ASEAN is somehow like the EU, and it's not the same kind of political animal. As Jacques Delors said, he described Europe as a UPI, an unidentified political object. And ASEAN, say a question of a free trade agreement with ASEAN. You can't sign a free ASEAN. The ASEAN Secretariat doesn't have the capacity nor the mandate to negotiate a free trade agreement. The European Union Commission does have that mandate. It's one of its supranational powers. So this leads to disappointment. We can see it occurring now on Myanmar, when, in a sense, the Europeans, like the Americans, from my view, have been morally irresponsible in saying we leave it up to ASEAN to solve the problem. It's kind of a cop-out in some ways, because ASEAN doesn't have this capacity to bring about changes within. It doesn't have the carrots and sticks within a member state. Doesn't have the political will. I mean, what's in it for Prime Minister Hun Sen or General Prayut, to have a flourishing democracy on its borders? To us, the question is to almost give it the answer. But maybe we'll come back to Myanmar later. But certainly you can see in the Indo-Pacific strategy in other European, there is this incredible emphasis on ASEAN. And certainly it's that area of the Indo-Pacific that the Europeans feel that they have some weight, and that they can have some sort of role as a kind of as a third party, as an alternative between the US and China, and therefore they play to the general Southeast Asian way of doing foreign relations, which is to hedge and to soft balance, to use those jargonistic terms, and so that is at least rhetorically well received, for I gather, within ASEAN.
Can I just add to that? I think I agree with David that ASEAN has this kind of wicked problem whereby it's expected to kind of function like the European Union when, exactly they're entirely different animals. But I guess you can, to its credit, ASEAN does try to learn the way that how the European Union is structured, in how ASEAN organizes itself. And to answer your question earlier about, whether kind of supranational agencies like the EU and whether it matters more than kind of national initiatives in the region, my first point to make is that the European Union has a lot of purchase in ASEAN. If to make a shameless self-plug of my institute, we come out with the State of Southeast Asian Survey every year in January. And the question was posed to about 1,032 respondents asking, who do you think, which external power would champion the free trade agenda? And I think the European Union was placed second, just behind the United States, or behind the United States led by the Biden administration. Another question was, which external power would ASEAN use as a hedge to hedge against the concurrent Sino-American rivalry? And again, the European Union was placed first. About 40% of the respondents chose the European Union. So in a sense, the European Union is near yet far. It's near as in we see you as a provider of what essentially is a rules-based international order. We see you as far because, in terms of perceptions, you're not on the radar every day. Another point that I like to make is in terms of individual European countries, and I'm using the term European and not European Union because of course I'm referring to the United Kingdom as well. In this sense, sometimes the sums in themselves is more than the sum of the parts, as in the individual European countries, they do make an impact that is significant beyond what the European Union is doing. I remember at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018 or 19, if I remember, when the French turned out with the Charles de Gaulle carrier at Changi Naval Base in Singapore, and Florence Parly, the French defense minister, she spoke at the Shangri-La Dialogue, and she made quite a good speech at the dialogue, which is essentially talking about what David spoke about. France is a resident Indo-Pacific power. We have like 2 million square miles of exclusive economic zone, and I brought the Charles de Gaulle accompanied by destroyers and as a complement of British helicopters on board. And there was kind of a bidding war between the UK and France as to who has more power and presence in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that in that sense it was welcomed in a sense, because on top of the European Union being a model of a regional organization that is into human rights and democracy and universal values, we like to see the European Union, even individual European countries, actually showing the flag and some power and presence in the terms of maritime kind of deployments, because as you can see, the Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific region is increasingly contested, and a major component of that is growing Chinese maritime power, and any kind of European kind of naval presence is welcome.
Yeah, I think my view is that ASEAN governments want lots of attention. They want the opportunities that come with having many different powers wanting to get involved, but they're also obviously concerned that these tensions will become destabilizing. I mean, it's but there are if you're Indonesia and you have Japan and China bidding to build your high-speed rail link, for example, there are opportunities and risks that come with that. You get do you get a better rail system, or do you get a sort of fragmented politics? I mean, you have to kind of learn how to manage that. But I think Southeast Asian governments have a lot of experience of behaving in that kind of environment. But I think, as I think the others have been saying, we're not going to see a single Southeast Asian position on most questions. I mean, as David was suggesting, I mean, the ASEAN's job is quite different from that of the European Commission. I think ASEAN's secretariat staff is 1% of the size of the European Commission, and so it's. For ASEAN, it's about coordinating sovereign governments, whereas I think in the EU, obviously, you have a much more integrated arrangement, as he was saying. Does that mean, I think anybody wanting to engage with Southeast Asian countries has to kind of work on two levels simultaneously. You have to work with the governments, and you have to try and have a sort of regional approach at the same time. And that's why the EU has only been able to negotiate free trade arrangements with Vietnam and Singapore, isn't it? So it's only the two, and it wants to go further. But there are so many, as you were sort of suggesting, the more countries you put into the mix, the more difficult it becomes. And I've sat in several sort of EU ASEAN discussions where Malaysia and Indonesia sit very quietly until the subject of palm oil is raised, and suddenly they lean forward and they're the most passionate people in the room, and it becomes difficult.
Talking about green imperialism.
Yeah.
Yes, I think what was interesting after the AUKUS announcement, the reactions within the ASEAN countries. There were countries that received the AUKUS in a favorable light. Vietnam, at least the Philippine foreign minister, Du Tet was a little bit more nuanced. And then there were countries that were much more reserved, Indonesia and Malaysia. And it all has to do with China. The image I like to use about China is, China's like the rich mother-in-law. You prefer to have a rich mother-in-law than a poor mother-in-law, because if she's poor, you have to look after her. So you'd rather have a rich mother-in-law who look after you. But the further you are away from her, the happier you are. Okay. In relation, I think the problem for the countries of Southeast Asia is that the Sino-American rivalry is played out in Northeast Asia, in the Taiwan Straits, Japan, China, and the US, and Indonesia, for example, doesn't have a maritime territorial dispute with China, but the Chinese, once again, Xi Jinping is working hard to bring Indonesia into the sort of slightly anti-Chinese camp by maritime actions in the Natuna Sea. And of course, the concern, there's a wonderful Brookings paper published last year called "Don't Ask Us to Choose," and it was about Southeast Asia. And I think the Biden administration, the latest speech by Anthony Blinken in Jakarta, I think the Americans are finally starting to learn that it's best not to push the countries of Southeast Asia to have to make this choice. In that sense, you need to make the US more attractive. The problem for the US is that President Trump's, one of the stupidest decisions he made was to withdraw the US from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because that was, American foreign policy in Asia going back to the annexation of the Philippines in 1898 has always had three dimensions: trade, security, and promotion of democracy, human rights. And Trump, by abandoning the TPP, withdrawing the US, abandoned what Obama had seen as to be the instrument for the US's economic influence in the Asia Pacific, and one which was very favorably received, for example, by countries like Vietnam, who, according to the Peterson study, the Peterson Institute report, would have been the greatest beneficiary of the TPP, 6% growth rate. So the Americans are now trying to pedal back, and they're talking about a new economic partnership. But damn it, you had this wonderful instrument that you actually determine the rules largely, and you abandoned it. And now, well, the Japanese and the Koreans and the Australians have moved on, and with others to have this partnership. So how the US will come back is a bit problematic.
And maybe bringing it to exactly those expectations in the region towards the US, towards the EU. What do you think should be the key tangible objectives that the Europeans should set for themselves that would be the objectives that are sought after in the region? So to make an offer that is actually attractive and is going to be received positively in the region, because very often a number of those things, when we talk about connectivity, standardization, a lot of the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy is also about EU's own economic security. But what do you think should be the tangible objectives that the EU is putting on the table for the strategy to be positively received in the region when it's being implemented?
Yeah, if I can answer that, Greg. There's a famous Hollywood movie starring Tom Cruise called Jerry Maguire, where, of course, there's a famous scene in which he's chatting with the pro athlete, and the pro athlete is saying, "Show me the money." And I think the same can be said for Southeast Asian countries to the European Union. I'll say the two Bs: show me the bills and show me the bullets. And when I say the bills, I would say, in terms of your global gateway, it's an ambitious initiative, $300 billion, and like David said, a lot of it is coming from the private sector. So of course, we want to see tangible projects that can be done. projects that the European Union will be comfortable with in terms of labor and environmental standards, and how, whether they are sustainable projects. And we want to see, how this can be worked out, because if you look at kind of on the infrastructure angle, the Chinese and the Japanese are way ahead of the European Union, right? The Chinese with their BRI, whatever you say about BRI and the debt trap diplomacy, ASEAN countries have taken to it with, varying degrees of kind of receptiveness. Japan, on some measures, is actually the biggest contributor of infrastructure financing to Southeast Asia, and even pipping China. So we like to see the European Union come out with kind of tangible projects that, will kind of caught the attention, the bandwidth of Southeast Asian countries. And of course, like what Bill was saying earlier, we would like to see at some point a EU-ASEAN FTA. I do not know how long that is going to take, given the complexities of individual Southeast Asian countries, but that would be something tangible to aim for. And in terms of bullets, like I was saying earlier, it would be good to see a kind of a European Union or European, and when I say European, to include the United Kingdom, kind of coordinated kind of forays into the maritime space, into the Indo-Pacific, having joint exercises with individual Southeast Asian countries, not specifically in kind of contested waters in the South China Sea maybe, but in the high seas in the South China Sea, as a demonstration of a desire to keep sea lanes of communications open. I think that would be welcome.
Sorry, I'll let perhaps Bill answer, but no, I'll let Bill perhaps answer first while I collect my thoughts.
Well, I mean, I think, echoing William, I mean, it's really about trade and doing business and increasing prosperity. I mean, that's really, I think, what motivates Southeast Asians. I mean, I have a little formulation about how Southeast Asians have responded to the Belt and Road ideas, which is need, greed, and fear. There are, there's clearly a massive amount of need. Anybody who's sat in a traffic jam in Jakarta or wherever understands the need for infrastructure. There are also plenty of people who will be willing to, go along with projects, even if there's no economic rationale for them, because there are side benefits, shall we say. Just how many, giant container ports, does, Southeast Asia need? Can they all function? Probably not, but there's enough going on the side that they will probably get some permissions anyway. But then there's this fear, as David's idea of the wealthy mother-in-law. Just the fact that China is just so huge that it dominates, and the main impact of the China-ASEAN free trade area, over the last decade or so, has been to create a massive trade deficit, for most Southeast Asian, countries with China. And so there's that concern that, it's one of those things. I doubt if the Chinese notice just how dominant they have become or how that kind of plays out, because they just think they're doing what they're doing, they're just trading or whatever. And it's only when you're on the receiving end of a sort of avalanche of plastic products or whatever, and your local businesses can't cope, can't compete, that you then become kind of fearful of what's going on. And then you add in, of course, the military, the geopolitical stuff as well. And so having to sort of balance all of that. So what can the Europeans offer? Well, I mean, they can offer, an alternative pole of power and stability. The Europeans will always have this sort of little kind of asterisk, kind of when they talk to Southeast Asians, because it's sort of part of European social political thinking that we like conditions, we like rules, we like human rights, we like environmental protection, all that kind of stuff, and that has mixed receptions in Southeast Asia. Some countries, Philippines, Indonesia, you can talk quite happily about democracy. Obviously, Vietnam, Cambodia, it's more difficult. When Cambodia starts to move against the political opposition, the European Union gets, wary and starts imposing sanctions, and then the Cambodians say, "Hang on, you've got a free trade agreement with Vietnam next door, and it's much worse there." And so we end up in all these kind of difficult, trade-offs and things. Talk about direction of travel. You mentioned, I think, one point about standard setting, and it's going to become. The next bit of standard setting is going to be in the digital world. Whose agreements on data protection and sovereignty and internet and all that kind of stuff. That's going to get quite difficult, I think, in the coming decades. And the Europeans have been able to set the rules with things like GDPR. And how is that going to work with what Southeast Asians want? In my experience, whenever a Southeast Asian government talks about cybersecurity, what they really mean is taking things off the internet that they don't like. There are very different conceptions about what some of these words mean.
Yeah, I think it comes back to these different conceptions of European power. We like to talk about Europe as a normative power, Europe's soft power, its attractiveness. My colleague Chad Damrow in the University of Edinburgh promoted this idea of Europe as a market power, and that's Europe's attractiveness. Frankly, to the countries of Southeast Asia, is it's the world's largest single market. And if you ask yourself the question, where does Europe impose its standards? Well, you've invented a gizmo, a machine. You want to sell it to the world. Well, you're going to have to meet, European technical standards, because once you met those, you can then export it probably to other countries as well. An example about 10 years ago was the Indonesians agreed to rather drastic conditions on exporting timber to the European Union. Well, it's a $1 billion, dollar market, and it's worth for $1 billion, meeting these environmental conditions for sustainable forestry. Of course, the problem afterwards, like as in a lot of FTA agreements that the European Union signed, and this realization is now coming, is implementation and compliance. We've even seen with the EU agreement with Korea. That there are problems about labor conditions. The agreement signed with Vietnam, when I was teaching in Hanoi, I talked about this quite a few people. And they say, "You sure in Vietnam we signed up to the agreement about free trade unions, but don't lose any sleep waiting for us to actually implement it." So we can sign these principles, but how you can then enforce compliance? I think. As Bill Hayton was saying, the conditionalities that Europe imposes on environment, gender questions, and others, well, if there are alternative forms of investment, if you're an autocratic leader, you may not want to, meet those kind of conditionalities. I think where the Europeans need to play to their strengths is with, it's a very vague term, but with civil society. Some of the most effective work that the Europeans do in Southeast Asia is done by the German Stiftung. I'm impressed by the dialogues and the work that they do with civil society groups in promoting questions concerned with democracy, human rights, and the environment. So we need to regional organizations. It's a truism. Reinforce executive power. ASEAN reinforces the executive power of the member states. And if we're thinking, and you don't have an ASEAN parliament as such, which is elected to sort of counterbalance that as you do in Europe. So, given that reality that inter-regional relations is about relations between executives, then I think you've got to be thinking in terms of 2-track, 3-track sort of activities with civil society groups. Of course, the Europeans can contribute to security in Southeast Asia. The French make very good fighter aircraft called the Rafale. If the Indonesians are listening, they've thoroughly recommended. The United Arab Emirates have just bought some, and we won't be as nasty as the Americans if you buy them. Okay, but seriously, there can be that sort of contribution indirectly in terms of security, and some, I would say, largely symbolic presence in the South China Sea. But I think the Europe's role is elsewhere.
And referring to exactly this point about contribution to security in the region, I want to bring our discussion towards the question of Taiwan and the tensions in the Taiwanese Strait. So Taiwan is mentioned in the Indo-Pacific strategy by the EU as an economic and digital partner important for strategic tech-related issues, specifically in the context of semiconductors production and supply chains. But we have also seen other moves by the European Parliament, by Lithuania. We also saw more and more European lawmakers engaging with the Taiwanese side. And now we, of course, have this spat between Beijing and Vilnius that is escalating quite quickly. We have discussion about the potential use of secondary sanctions as an example of economic coercion pursued by China towards Lithuania, which brings the issue to the European level. So it just seems that the situation is becoming very tense, even though over those last few weeks in Brussels, the buzzword in discussions on China was re-engagement out and how to reopen the channels of communication between Beijing and Brussels. So what do you think we can expect in terms of relations between Beijing and Brussels in the context of what is happening with Lithuania and Taiwan? And also, what is the ASEAN's take on the tensions in the Taiwanese Strait? And also Taiwanese position in the region in general, including in the context of its new southbound policy that has been pursued by Taipei.
Just a preliminary comment, and I think Bill Hayton would have a lot more to say on this, is that we haven't really integrated what has happened in Hong Kong. Because what has happened in Hong Kong has demonstrated that the notion of one country, two systems, I think the technical word is bullshit. Okay, the more we'd like to delude ourselves that this was possible, and what happened in Hong Kong has demonstrated what was predictable, that progressively Hong Kong would be absorbed. Now, that had an impact within Europe, because once Britain left the EU, Hong Kong lost its great defender in the European Parliament and within the EU. So the response to what has occurred in Hong Kong has been largely British, with the Europeans, patting the Brits on the back on the side with this, generous offer of accepting 350,000 people from Hong Kong. So that's the kind of the background prior to what has occurred in Taiwan. And Taiwan have been the great beneficiaries of the COVID pandemic, and this concern about supply chain. And I think that is what's changed if you like, the situation. It really has to do with the COVID pandemic. And also, I must admit, very effective Taiwanese lobbying in Brussels and in European capitals. Long-term efforts to maintain a Taiwanese diplomatic presence and keep Taiwan on the radar screen. But I'll let others more aware of the situation to go on about that.
Shall I chip in maybe some thoughts? I mean, I think as David was saying there, there has been a big change in European views of what China wants and how it's going to behave in the world. And Hong Kong was a big part of that. Certainly in the UK, the scrapping of the one country, two systems law was really taken very badly here. But I think more generally across Europe, the way that China behaved with things like supply chains during the COVID pandemic, and contracts that weren't honoured, and basically so many European countries have basically assumed that in their pandemic preparedness that the pandemic would only affect one country at a time, and that therefore they could, import the masks they needed from China, and then suddenly a pandemic is a pandemic, and then China is prioritizing its own supplies, and they all felt let down, and that's kind of, and there was a lot of the way that was handled, I think, has created a big skepticism, and that adds on to all the previous stuff about Chinese companies buying up important strategic companies in Germany and France and Britain and all that kind of stuff. So there's been a change of attitude there. At the same time, Xi Jinping's vision of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is a very territorial narrative. I mean, partly it's about prosperity, but it's also about, getting back all the land that China feels, was taken away from it, over the previous 150 years. And so that emphasis on territorial unity and harmony and, kind of homogenous society within China, that's quite different from the way Europeans look at these things. I mean, in the recent history, Slovakia and the Czech Republic have separated, peacefully. Obviously, Lithuania and the other Baltic states, they broke away from the Soviet Union because they wanted to be different. We have the experience of Yugoslavia, which was very bloody, and so our approach has been to, tolerate, or encourage autonomy, and then create laws and trading relations, which basically mean that national boundaries become less important within the EU. Whereas Xi Jinping is all about, integration, harmony. Tibet is going to be part of China, Taiwan, that's the sense. And so you have these very, very different ways of thinking about how you manage, diversity within your populations and all the rest of it. And so I think, the question of Taiwan just puts all of this on the table. Do you tolerate autonomy in different ways of doing things, or do you insist on, one nation, one state? And that's why I think it's become so emotional and difficult. And it used to be, I think, a way of just thinking, how do we practically manage, our relations with this? I mean, I've been to the it's a silly story. If you go to visit the British representative office in Taiwan, they have exactly the same crockery as they do in other embassies, except there isn't a coat of arms on the plate because it's not a proper embassy, And so we've always had to kind of have these kind of little ways of working our way around these kind of issues. But now it's becoming, I think now the real crux of the issue is coming out into the open. And I fear that the more Taiwan, talks about independence or that option, the more we're going to see a reaction from the Chinese side. And so I do fear that we are getting into a more confrontational posture now.
And the fact that Taiwan has now become a sort of touchstone issue, I can see this, in my native country in Australia, where, about in the AUKUS debate. The fact that you would say you were not going to defend Taiwan, I'm not sure what the Australians can contribute, but anyway, it then becomes sort of a test of your patriotism. And now within the European Union, Taiwan and the Uyghur issues, in terms of the touchstone issues, have largely replaced questions about Tibet. I remember the Olympic Games in 2008, the protests were all about Tibet. Tibet is completely sort of forgotten now in Europe in terms of talking about human rights in the People's Republic of China. It is the Uyghur, Xinjiang, and now Taiwan. And the Americans are not really being helpful, because by making sort of Taiwan a touchstone issue, and sort of pushing others to more or less situate themselves in relation to that, is not terribly helpful either in the American interest, but certainly not in the interests of third parties.
If I can contribute to that, Greg, to begin with, I think in Southeast Asia, I think there's you won't see it in the public sphere, but like what David is saying, I think there's should we say, a kind of a silent happiness in Southeast Asia, that there's a growing sense of realpolitik in the European Union, Japan, and Australia when it comes to the idea of Taiwan. I mean, just another silly story, if you like. We took our two sons to Taiwan a couple of years back, and they loved it. I mean, the energy of the place, the freewheeling nature of the place, the fact that it's a functioning, although should we say, a boisterous democracy, you know, the proliferation of media outlets, they loved it. And I think people are beginning to recognize Taiwan for what it is. It's kind of an example of what an Asian/Chinese society could be when it deals with capitalism and kind of a functioning democracy. And I think an example of that would be Australia. If you were around long enough in the late 90s, Australia had a foreign minister called Alexander Downer, if I remember correctly, 1997, and he was asked, like, what would Australia do if there was a Taiwan Strait contingency? And he basically fudged the question, and he said that, well, we have to kind of study the scenarios, and it's hypothetical. We're not 100% committed. Look at Australia today. As to its kind of inclinations to support the U.S. Navy in any Taiwan Straits contingency. On a kind of slightly unrelated point, I think on every big geopolitical problem that you see in the Indo-Pacific, the convenient kind of way of stating things is you blame the Americans. I mean, it was the Americans who came out with this double deceit, right? When they switched recognition from Taipei to Beijing in the 70s and the Taiwan Relations Act. These are kind of the strategic ambiguity that the Americans had. It was not resolved. I mean, and now it's kind of the problem is coming to the fore. When it comes to ASEAN as well, I would say quite confidently there's no consensus ASEAN view. I don't think ASEAN will want to comment on Taiwan, simply because there's a hypersensitivity to what China would think. Officially, every individual Southeast Asian country adheres to the one China policy, but I suppose, and I might be wrong, that if the situation in the Taiwan Strait deteriorates, ASEAN might come up with a statement, but I'm not confident of that. But obviously, a kind of anodyne statement on the need for peace to be restored in the Strait. The last point I'd like to make is that do not forget that there are individual Southeast Asian countries that have good relations with Taiwan, albeit not on the official capacity. I mean, take for example, my home country, Singapore. I mean, Singapore has a long-standing relationship with Taiwan. We have military training in Taiwan. Taiwan helped the Singapore Armed Forces at the early stage of its development in the late 60s. And Singapore, of course, we got into trouble with China when some of our infantry fighting vehicles were detained in Hong Kong. I think that was 2016 now. And we got into a patch of border with Beijing. And so you do have this kind of study individual Southeast Asian countries and their relationships with Taiwan.
Thank you. And I wanted to bring it back a little bit to the question of the spat between Lithuania and Beijing. Specifically about the issue, how can we move forward with this? Because the situation in which we find ourselves right now is Brussels and Lithuanian side is claiming that it's following the EU's One China policy, which basically is interpreted as well that anything bar the legal diplomatic recognition of Taiwan is on the table. So even meetings between governmental officials from the European side and Taiwanese side are definitely in line with One China policy, and Lithuania's actions were all in line with that. Beijing, with its One China principle and its interpretation of EU's One China policy, doesn't see it this way and sees we see that escalating. Even now, the Lithuanian diplomats had to evacuate from the downgraded embassy in Beijing. So, how do you see this evolving, and is there any way out to conclude this spat that is escalating to the EU level? Because it seems to be about the negotiation on the interpretation of the EU's One China policy and whether Brussels sees it the way that Beijing wants to do it, or does it stick to the interpretation that it has been promoting for a long time?
Well, it's possible that David, being in the EU, might have a more authoritative view on this. But I mean, it's going to be a real headache for the EU, particularly with the Beijing Olympics approaching. Are they going to accept this and just say, you know, Lithuania was a small state and, you know, doesn't, you know, France and Germany are still going to send their, you know, representatives to the Olympics, or is there going to be a European position on this, and we're all going to stand up for Lithuania? You know, we're hearing reports that there's in effect a trade boycott on Lithuania. Is the EU collectively going to stand up and say, you know, an EU product is an EU product? So yeah, I think you know it's a really tough one. It's going to have to be finessed in some way. Otherwise, this relatively small dispute could become something that really overshadows the whole EU-China relationship. Is the EU politically ready to kind of take a stand, and say it's entirely up to us to talk to whoever we want to talk to, or do you have a veto over our policies? Could you see a situation where China starts to, encourage, Catalan separatists or whatever to kind of, in a kind of, tit for tat arrangement? I see this as, I think some European diplomats are going to have some sleepless nights over the next few weeks and months.
There will be a need to kind of try and finesse a solution. One would hope that the Europeans would stand firm on maintaining their own interpretation of what the one country, two systems policy represents. My fear is that, and this comes from speaking to the EU ambassador in Beijing, is that political leaderships like those in Hungary and I hate to say it, in Poland, particularly in Hungary, will veto a European position. So in those cases, there will be a statement from the European Commission, but it won't have the weight of coming from all of the European member states. And of course, this, as you are aware, this is the concern within, is China trying to divide Europe, and especially investment in Hungary and Central and Eastern Europe. Is this a form of an attempt to divide China? It is also linked to political debates within Europe itself about the rule of law, democratic conditionalities and those kinds of things. But I think there is my sense in Brussels is that there is an appetite for being to be firmer about Lithuania, especially as the investment agreement is now off the table. My argument has been that actually the Chinese didn't want that agreement, and were in fact, others disagree on this, but my view was that the Chinese showed their goodwill by saying they wanted this agreement. When it was not ratified, they were then because they had to make the most concessions, they were then in the wonderful position of taking the moral high ground. Well, we offered the agreement, it was the others who refused it, and therefore we are committed to free trade and other things. But there'll have to be some way of diffusing this, but I'm not sure how the diplomats are going to work their way through this.
Thank you very much. And then maybe to continue in this line to
I think
talk.
William wanted to say something. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm fine. Go ahead.
Yes. So continuing with this line and looking into the future. So it does seem that boosting the relations with the Indo-Pacific is supposed to be one of the priorities of the French presidency of the EU that is around the corner. So my question to all of you would be, what do you expect to happen during French presidency? France is the most dedicated actor when it comes to, is most dedicated to boosting EU's presence, not only when it comes to strategic autonomy idea coming from President Macron, but also in the Pacific, as David explained before, how much the French were involved in shaping the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. So what are your hopes for EU's engagement with ASEAN and with Indo-Pacific at large throughout the next months, especially during French presidency?
Perhaps I'll reply as seeing I'm situated in Paris. Certainly, Obama saw himself as the first Pacific president of the United States. In some sense, Emmanuel Macron sees himself as the first Indo-Pacific, president of France. Well, he was, let me put it this way: he was the first French president to make the link between France's global role and the fact that it has these territories in the Pacific, in the South Pacific, and in the Indian Ocean, and that they are an integral part of France being an Indo-Pacific country. I must admit, he also said that France was an Amazonian country because of French Guiana. So one has to take these things a little bit with but that's why also AUKUS had caused such an emotional outcry in France, because it was 20 years, 40 years of diplomatic efforts after the nuclear testing, to try and get this harmonious partnership on the rails, and it's all gone down the gurgler, so to speak. Certainly, in terms of, my center is organizing a colloquium on the 20th and 21st of January on the Indo-Pacific in relation to the French presidency. They have commissioned a number of policy papers from various think tanks and others, and they're really, certainly it is a priority area in French foreign policy. AUKUS has meant that the partnerships they're talking about have now become a bit different. India and Japan, but now Indonesia, with the visit of the French foreign minister a couple of weeks ago. So they will put a great deal of importance on this. My concern is that, we all love dialogues, and we all, love talking about shared values, but let's have a case study. If we're serious about the European ASEAN relations, let's work together on a subject, and the subject is the subject which is the most threatening to ASEAN, is the situation in Myanmar. Now, this will mean that the ASEAN countries may do a different kind of thing than the Europeans, but my argument is that we need to have a sort of a bad cop, good cop approach, with the European countries recognizing the National Unity Government, the government in exile, the government that is a reflection of the free elections of November 2020, and the ASEAN countries maintaining their present position. But in seeing ASEAN as central, the European countries are a little bit confused, because centrality can mean two things. It can mean positioning, or it can mean a way of functioning, capacity. Now, when ASEAN said it's central, which is a term that comes into the ASEAN lexicon after 2006, it's about its position within the various concentric circles of regional integration in Asia, the Asia Pacific, APEC, East Asia, and now the Indo-Pacific. But it doesn't tell us anything about capacity as such. To be central is not necessarily having the capacity to be able to deal with a particular issue. So I think, we will disagree on how we should move, on which ways we should move forward. But I think there's a need to move forward together on Myanmar. With the British, and again, one of the multiple foreign policy collateral damage tragedies of Brexit not is Hong Kong, but also Myanmar, because when Britain was a member of the EU, it had its great champion. Myanmar had its great champion in the European Parliament. That is no longer the case.
One thing that David didn't mention, which I think is the fact that France has an election in April. It's the middle of its EU presidency, and also Australia has an election, has to be called before May, I think. So my assumption is that France and Australia will continue, sniping at each other for political reasons, at least until their elections, and then maybe there's a chance for a reset depending on what happens in the elections.
That is certainly the view from both in Canberra and Paris. I was with Rory Medcalf yesterday in a dialogue, Franco-Australian dialogue, and the sense is that nothing will be resolved till after the elections in both countries. So.
Meanwhile, I'm told that French and Australian diplomats haven't had any conversations in London since September. So
or in Paris.
Or in Paris. Right,
the ambassador is frozen out.
Right, but at lower levels, I think there is, there are naval symposia and that sort of thing taking place.
And also police cooperation. There was a meeting there. Yeah.
I would expect France to make a big thing for all the reasons that David has said of the Indo-Pacific, particularly during the run-up to the elections. He also mentioned Myanmar. I mean, my feeling is that there's a kind of sense of impotence in the UK and it's partly a response to the rise of China, the sense that whatever the Europeans, and the traditional European response would be to impose sanctions on the junta, and it's done that, but just a sense that no matter what we did, China would continue to trade, and so it would just be to our own disadvantage, and so our usual tools in this matter don't seem to work, which is a response, reflection of the rise of China. I think fairly early on.
Can I just say that China is playing, perhaps William could agree or disagree. China is playing a sort of a double game in Myanmar. For example, the WA, which is the WA army, which is the best trained and the best armed, has remained outside of the conflict so far. And that's because of Chinese instructions. The Chinese have dissuaded the junta so far from banning the National League for Democracy. They've been happy about Aung San Suu Kyi being arrested, but they don't want the party banned. And they, in fact, invited members of the NLD to Beijing a couple of months ago. And if one looks, it was objectively in the democratic transition was actually in China's interest. That Aung San Suu Kyi managed to finesse quite a good relationship with the Chinese. And it's the military, in fact, who moved from getting their arms procurement from China to Russia during that period. So I don't think there's not much love lost, so to speak, between Beijing and the junta. And I think the question is, can we persuade the Chinese that it's within their interest that that there's some kind of return to a transition? I mean, China needs Myanmar more than Myanmar needs China. That's the reality of the situation. The two pipelines that go into the Bay of Bengal are vital strategically for China's energy security for Yunnan. And it's a question of persuading the Chinese that their interests are best protected in a democratic Myanmar than in an authoritarian Myanmar. Sorry.
Yeah, and which just I think emphasizes the point I was about to make, which was there is actually, if it's done carefully and cleverly, a chance for US, EU, China coordination on Myanmar. It's not like each government is backing a different player in the country, and so it's just a question of whether that's possible given the other disputes which are kind of going on simultaneously. I don't know if William has a good point.
Yeah, if I can add, I think if you talk, Bill is exactly right. I mean, in the United Nations, I think the Americans and Chinese have agreed to disagree on, essentially keeping the NLD appointed ambassador to the United Nations, and we will have to see what gives from that. But I think that I absolutely agree with what David said earlier about the good cop, bad cop kind of situation. In a sense, to use a term that was used during the Obama administration when they were in the Libya conflict, the Americans were accused of leading from behind. I'm afraid that on Myanmar, the Americans cannot afford to lead from behind. I mean, you can say all you like about ASEAN is the primary entity to deal with Myanmar, and to an extent that is true, but we need the support. ASEAN needs the support, the heavyweight support from the European Union and the Americans when it comes to pressuring the junta. And one tangible way that you can do that is to do it the way Japan did it, in a sense that Japan brought its weight to bear to kind of persuade kind of ASEAN member states not to allow kind of high-level ministerial representation at the recent ASEAN summits. And as we can see, it worked. And I think that the more the European Union will say, the Americans will say, we will not appear at any meeting, whether it's virtual or in person, with the junta being present, I think that would send the correct signal, to the junta as to where we want this to go. And of course, the most tangible kind of signpost that we want to look at is Cambodia's chair of ASEAN in 2022, and to see whether this kind of will continue with regards to Myanmar's participation in high-level ASEAN summits. I think it'd be good to see sustained pressure, not only from the European Union, but from the United States.
And also, we mustn't forget India's role. India, the Modi government has been, for me, the most, disappointing in terms of how they've dealt with the Myanmar crisis. I mean, the Quad was meant to be the four great democracies coming together in the Indo-Pacific. But on Myanmar, the Modi administration, the Modi government made sure that there was no actual clear declaration on Myanmar. So the principle of promoting democracy was absent. And what's happening on the border, we know a lot of what's happening on the border with Thailand. And the Thais already have 1 million Burmese refugees from Myanmar in the country, who are vital to the Thai economy. We often forget. Whereas on the border, that's where a lot of the violence is now occurring, in Chin State and Saigon. It's not clear, India itself has many sort of separatist kind of problems in its own northeast. But India is really a key player in Myanmar that ASEAN shouldn't forget either.
Thank you. And following with the line of those predictions and zooming out a little bit on this topic, as we discussed before, basically every major actor is becoming with Indo-Pacific strategies of some sorts. There is a real influx of those. And we also noticed an increased activity of middle powers in the Southeast Asian region, Australia, Japan, France, Germany, UK, Russia. Do you think that this greater involvement, and all those strategies, is it actually stabilizing the region that is also facing the Washington-Beijing competition playing out in that arena as well? Or are those all strategies and involvement from middle powers is actually destabilizing the region even further? What would be your take?
I can answer that. The short answer, Greg, is yes and no.
Yes, courageous answer, William.
Yes, as in when Lee Kuan Yew was around, I think he made very cogent remarks about how, as a small Asia-Pacific nation state, Singapore always wanted more major powers into the mix for kind of a equilibrium in terms of balance of power. So to have middle powers showing interest in participating in the Indo-Pacific, that has a stabilizing element to that. But I say no because there's an action-reaction cycle for every French, German, British, Japanese action in the Indo-Pacific. There is a counter-action or counter-reaction from Beijing. And I think one tangible example of that is that you remember when the Quad was first announced, and the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was famously quoted as saying that it will dissipate like sea foam. I don't think it's dissipating at the moment. In fact, the Quad has actually gone from strength to strength, especially this year. They've had, from moving from virtual to physical meetings. So you will see that Beijing will really want to kind of up the ante in kind of combating the Quad, especially in kind of individual relationships with, shall we say, certain continental ASEAN member states, and wanting to counter the Quad. So in a sense, there's risk and opportunity on that count. Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I might add is, yes, lots of middle powers, but come a crisis, you could see the middle powers lining up into blocks. You could see a China-Russia bloc and a US, Japan, Korea, Australia, UK, European bloc, for example, and that would just make it a lot worse, potentially. So, yeah, as long as everybody's got their own special interests and they're all competing with different perspectives, I imagine, you'll have a lot of, duplication and wastage as, the Europeans and the UK and Australia and the US all try and court Southeast Asia, and effectively about the same things, but saying, come on my course, take part in my exercise, do a deal with me, and they're not going to coordinate. And there are opportunities there, but there will also be, confusion and delay. So, I think we're going to see a lot more diplomacy, a lot more kind of nitty gritty sort of jostling, I think, between these powers. But in some ways that might be better than everybody forming up into grand alliances.
I think the underlying problem is that public opinion, both in China and in the US, is pushing, aggravating this Sino-American rivalry. I mean, in China, nobody believes in communism anymore as a sort of motivating trope, so to speak. So, patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrels, to quote Samuel Johnson. But seriously, I mean, my experience with generations of Chinese students is that each new generation seems to be more nationalistic than the previous one. And, a lot of I think my colleague Sean Breslin in University of Warwick has written, he does quite a bit of work also for Chatham House, I think, he's written a lot on cyber nationalism in China. And so this is being driven on both sides. And I fear that, there's going to be a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy about the coming confrontation between China and the United States. Hence, it is important that in theory at least, that middle powers play this mediating role. But as AUKUS symbolized, and as Bill has just mentioned, that the middle powers have now taken sides, or some of them have taken sides in a clearer way than was the case before. And that sort of actually limits their capacity for maneuver. Perhaps the Europeans may, in this case, have a more important role to play because they're not allied one way or the other with the US or China in the Indo-Pacific so far. But sorry, my cop out is wait and see.
Thank you. And what do you think is the perception of Beijing on those issues? Are all of those strategies, all of those regional ideas seen by Beijing as targeted against China? Or do you think that it's still that Beijing is going to explore some of them as potentially mutually beneficial, that there are areas in which synergy can be sought after? What do you think is the guiding perception in Zhongnanhai? William?
Well, I can't speak for the Chinese political leaders in Zhongnanhai, but I can say the commonly used phrase, I'm not paranoid, but everyone else is out to get me. I think you can pretty much apply that to the Chinese. Basically, the Chinese see things like, very Marxist dialectics, right? When it comes to Indo-Pacific strategies, anything that doesn't have a Chinese imprint is basically a pseudo containment of China. I think that's probably over-exaggerated, but the way that they see it is very black and white. And we all know that, like the Quad and the kind of free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, you cannot find any language in it that actually mentions China or the threat of China. But we know that practically speaking, the Chinese see that as pseudo-containment of China. And that same thing can be applied according to the Chinese view of the European Union's Indo-Pacific paper, in the sense that if you mention, kind of soft power elements such as human rights, democracy, freedom of navigation, the Chinese will take offense at that. So it's no fault of the European Union. It's no fault of the United States or Japan when it comes to FOIP, but it's just the way that the Chinese perceive it. And I think the bigger idea behind it is that, China perceives the region around its periphery as an extension of the Chinese Sinosphere, and any strategies offered on its periphery is considered a threat to China. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I mean, I often wonder, whenever you see or hear a Chinese official, talking about, when Southeast Asians make some kind of criticism, say on the South China Sea, the most obvious example, it's always sort of somehow that the Americans put them up to this, that they don't have their individual agency on that. And so that way of looking at the world, that everything is a sort of, manipulated by the big empire across the sea, does seem to be a kind of recurring feature. And so, they find it difficult, I think, to accept that other countries might have a different point of view, independent of any kind of grand clash of systems or whatever it might be. And so that's why Southeast Asia, I think, has a fundamental need to be engaged with Europe and as many other countries as possible, because it needs to create this sort of middle space and to protect it, between in the clash of great powers.
Yeah, the idea would be to create that middle space, but as William has said, I mean, the Chinese interpret everything as being sort of, in a sense, anti-Chinese. The Quad, and they feel, in a sense, Xi Jinping's his own worst enemy, because you talk about the Quad being anti-Chinese, which perhaps it was, and then you create border disturbances with India, and then sort of, this feeds into the narrative that China needs to be contained or to be dealt with, and I think what it comes back to Taiwan, is that we now have these sort of touchstone issues, Taiwan, in relation to Lithuania, etc., that if you don't take the Chinese side, then this is evidence that you're anti-Chinese. So, we're constantly feeding into this sort of narrative that the world is out to perpetuate the century of national humiliation. The world has not accepted that China is the world power, which it was, the world's largest economy, which it was prior to about 1850 anyway, and for domestic consumption in China itself, this is good politics. It's good domestic politics for the Chinese Communist Party. My worry in terms of Southeast Asia is there seems to be a denial of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence of 1954-55 of the spirit of Bandung, in which the populations of Chinese origin in Southeast Asia were acknowledged as not being Chinese, but perhaps say culturally Chinese, but of being citizens of the country where they found themselves. And we're talking about Southeast Asia, where historically, you know, Sinophobia, anti-Chinese pogroms, anti-Chinese riots, you know, been a constant of the history of Southeast Asia. I mean, the most recent is not that long ago, 20 years ago, after the fall of the Suharto regime in Indonesia and the beginning of Reformasi, you know, and the churches were burnt down, people were killed, women were raped. And so underneath this, you can see it in the Philippines, you know, that underneath there's this, the fear of the Chinese somehow as the overseas Chinese as the fifth column, that what Xi Jinping and his regime is doing is really, you know, I don't know, on the pouring oil on the fire, and this is really terribly unhelpful for all of Southeast Asia. It's an understatement.
And at the same time, exactly as we're slowly drawing to the conclusion of our discussion, that would be the point that I want to pick up on. So what can we do in terms of effective, proactive measures? So my final question to you would be, as we probably have listeners tuning in from Brussels, key European capitals, as they will be working on the implementation of the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, especially throughout the next months, what one key advice would you give to them if we have people from ministries of foreign affairs who are going to be working exactly on those issues? What key advice would you give them?
Okay, David, I mean, I'll go. I mean, unity. You mean, as you said, you know, Europe is a massive market. It's, you know, 28 important countries. It's, you know, they've got to work together. And unfortunately, if, you know, one country, you know, prevents unity, that's going to be, you know, it's a big hindrance to, you know, what the EU is trying to do. But I think it needs to stand firm on principles. Otherwise, you know, what else is Europe for, really? And so, I mean, the Lithuania thing is going to be a test. The agreement on investment is another test, and you know, the sanctions on the European parliamentarians another test. And I think that's really what's, you know, that's the big thing. It's going to be forging unity on those questions.
Yeah, I also just have one point to make, is that it's a tough neighborhood in the Indo-Pacific. So I'll repeat what I said earlier. You have to bring tangibles to the table, and I'm referring to that FTA between the European Union and ASEAN, and of course tangibles in terms of the global gateway. Yeah.
Yes, I would agree with that. So unity in principle and concentration on tangible subjects. You know, one would be some low-hanging fruit on digital connectivity, agreeing on standards, and secondly would be a subject which is existentially threatening to ASEAN, which is Myanmar, is you know, showing that working together differently, taking different tracks, that we can contribute to a solution to the crisis in Myanmar and the restoration of democracy in Myanmar, which you know, which will mean commitment of resources. It may mean further down the track things like putting boots on the ground in terms of, you know, peacekeeping or forces. I think the case. I think we should be looking at what happened in East Timor, in which EU, European, and ASEAN cooperation was crucial. That was a much easier situation in a sense to deal with, but you know, it's been largely unheralded, but it has been very important in bringing, allowing, you know, East Timor to become what it is today.
Thank you very much. It's a lot to process for all of us, I'm sure. It was a great overview of all the topics, and I think we put spotlight on some of the key issues, trying to look into the future, trying to discuss some of the actionable, practical advice also for some of the decision makers that might be listening to us. So really, thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I'm sure that we could be discussing it for hours upon hours and really dig into specific issues that we only highlighted during this discussion, but it was a real pleasure to talk with you about this. David, Bill, William, thank you very much for joining me, and thanks again for coming for this discussion.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
It was a great pleasure to find my souls with in such a trio. Probably the greatest since the Three Musketeers, I must say.
I would say. One for all.
And all for one.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, David.